Morning.
How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, really well, thanks.
Thank you for agreeing to do this.
Yeah, very welcome.
Thank you. Tony, if I can start, if you don't mind. You were the chair of Amcom before it was taken over by Vocus. Can you just give us a description of Amcom, what it did, and the size of it, so one can sort of gauge the relative size of the business?
Yeah, it was substantially an infrastructure telecoms business that focused in the metro and greater metro area of Perth and Adelaide, Darwin, and partly in the East Coast. And we'd built a series of fibre optic networks in those cities, and we provided internet access to large corporates and state government enterprises substantially. And then as the technology evolved, we got into data centers and corporate voice and those sorts of telecom products.
The Amcom group revenue for the calendar year 14 was 168.2 million, and the earnings were 47.3 million for that year. That's the calendar year 14. Okay, so then James came to see you about a merger around 2015. Can you just tell us about that meeting and how that went?
So initially, Amcom was looking to expand in the East, and we had an existing management team, and I was chair, and we met with David Spence and James to discuss putting the companies together with Amcom as the acquirer at the time. James was very quiet, didn't say much, and we talked about the synergies and how we should put these two companies together because Vocus was a strong name in Sydney and Melbourne markets, partly Brisbane, and we had the other capitals, and they were both similar businesses in terms of infrastructure and telecoms to enterprise, same customer base, so very complementary. And he went away, and David went away, and we didn't hear much from them after that, and then until they popped up with a 10% stake in Amcom, which was actually a very good day, as we'll find out.
So the feedback I got from the meeting was that you guys would not commit and you actually didn't know what you wanted. Is that not your recollection of that meeting?
We knew what we wanted strategically and why you should put them together. We didn't have a financial deal in terms of what the numbers would look like, but it was a discussion around effectively a merger because they were similar sized companies.
Right, and then James comes back to the board and he says he's going to send you this rejection letter, and he sent you this one of the shortest rejection letters in sort of the history. Remember what the rejection letter said?
I don't actually know. No, it was like a one-liner though. Thanks for your interest, but we're not interested, sort of thing.
It said thanks but no thanks, if my memory serves me right.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So you get this rejection letter from James. I'll come back to that, and then Vocus suddenly pops up on your share register. CBA has been buying the stock, and suddenly it owns 10%. What were your thoughts at the time? And you've just had this rejection letter. You've just spoken to the guy, and now he's gone and bought 10%.
Well, I thought, well, it's game on, that these companies should be put together. And instead of acting like the prey, I was quite happy that James had made the move. You know, he'd made a move on the chessboard to put these guys together. And as I say, the management on my side had been there for a long time. We'd been together for a long time, and we really needed to move into the East Coast. And as we were all domiciled in the West, you know, they were reluctant to spend a lot of time travelling. The Amcom leadership had been there for a long time. You know, we'd been going since '99, and this is 2015. That having a younger, energetic James Spenceley as the CEO, and having a mixed board in putting them together, especially with a focus on the East Coast, because we'd had 10 years of 20% earnings growth, which was a great outcome. But the mining boom at the time, 2/3 of those earnings came from Western Australia, and that was starting to flatten out. And so it was logical to focus on expanding in the bigger population centres where you've got larger head offices, because it was an enterprise business, and to have James be the CEO of a merged co. I was happy with that, and I think my management were happy to retire gracefully with good payouts, and then we retained the middle management at Amcom, and that maintained the substance of our core business in the geographies that we're in, and James brought a younger, energetic leadership. So I want to sort of try to emphasise that I was very close to my leadership, but they were very happy leavers ultimately when it turned around and James proposed, when James bought the 10%, or Vocus bought the 10%, and then said let's put these companies together. But his plan was for James and his leadership to be in the ascendancy in the management, the top two spots, and then put all the great people of Amcom and Vocus in terms of merit further down the chain together. And I think that was a match made in heaven.
And then you get a call from TPG. Did somebody phone you and say to you, we bought 19.9, or did you read about it? I can't remember what. Give us a bit of colour around that when that happened.
Yeah, so they already had a small shareholding that, because Pipe Networks, who'd been taken over by TPG, Bevan Slattery, had a shareholding in Amcom, a small one. TPG inherited that shareholding, and they just decided to lift it. They went substantial, and then they went beyond that to counter the Vocus move. And so obviously when you're actually going up by 1% increments, you've got to keep putting in a change of substantial shareholders notice. So that was all done through the ASX. I did have contact with Tio from previous years when we had the largest stake in IONET, and he was chasing IONET. So I'd had a relationship with him, but he was a very introverted person and wasn't well known for making a lot of contact in the outside world. So I tried to contact him after this to say, what are you going to do? And there was no reply, effectively. He was just trying to put his foot on Amcom because he knew that he wanted those geographies that we had large networks in and a very good client base for TPG's corporate aspirations at the time, because they were focused on Sydney and Melbourne. And so picking up all the other second-tier capitals was his geographic strategy as well. So he just thought by buying a large shareholding, he'd be able to block the whole thing.
And he tried. And if you look at TPG today, they're trying to now sell their whole network to Vocus. If it's in the newspaper, yes, for $6 billion.
Yeah. It's a big number, isn't it?
A big number, and it's interesting that, eh? It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's effectively the culmination of all the competitive infrastructure fibre assets that were created from the deregulation of the telecoms industry in the late 90s to culminating when Vocus and Amcom really, and M2, were taken over by Macquarie recently. There was a lot of the infrastructure players, so PowerTel, Pipe Networks, and there was a few others that were rolled up into various vehicles. But I think that those assets, whilst they're aging, they're still reasonably strategic. But that's a big number, and you can see what superannuation funds and large investors looking for annuity income on infrastructure, what they're
Oh,
willing
great
to pay.
assets.
Mm.
So then you decide that actually you really want to do this merger with Vocus. TPG owned 19.9, let's say 20%, and you really want to do this. And Vocus really wants to do it with you. And now you have to work out how you're going to get almost 80%. So 80% of the share register is now not controlled by TPG, but you need to get almost all 80% or 75 out of the 80 voting in favor of doing this merger.
It was unprecedented because there's never been a successful completion of a scheme meeting or an acquisition where there's an obstructing shareholder that has 19% who's publicly said we're going to vote against it. So when we announced the initial Vocus Amcom merger, the share price went up substantially because the markets could see the synergies in putting these two great companies together. And then when Tio, his shareholding went up to 19 and he announced that he's going to vote against it, the share price dropped. So there was a very clear signal that if you put our companies together, there would be value created for shareholders, Amcom and Vocus. And there was a clear outcome that if they weren't together, then the share price would drop because you weren't going to get the synergies and you wouldn't have the benefits of transnational business. So we had to convince the shareholding register, to roll up effectively to save their company, to vote and to actually create some benefits themselves, which meant mobilising mum and dad shareholders, institutions, and doing this through various ways. And so we spent an intense campaign sending out big red postcards to people because they don't usually open their mail, to try and access the smaller shareholders because we need every vote counted. We did videos with me talking to the camera saying that that TPG has bought into your company and they want to vote down this merger. And you can see that the share price went down. So if you want to create value, you've got to activate and come and vote for this merger. The institutions, we had the Credit Suisse desk, institutional desk ring all the institutions and making sure they're aware. And a little known fact is when institutions have their stock in a nominee company, it gets lent out if they permit it for stock lending, and they make a small return, 2 or 3% per annum, on their shares in Amcom in this case. And if the stock is out on loan, they can't vote. So we had to make sure that all the institutions call back their stock, their Amcom shares, from this stock lending opportunity that is prevalent in the institutional market, and so that they could actually vote their proxies. So there was a whole range of things.
And there was a lot of people, I remember, making phone calls, and everybody was sort of involved in this campaign to get the votes. And then we had a few scheme meetings which TPG challenged, but at the end of the day, we got almost, out of the 80%, we probably got almost everybody voted in favor of the scheme.
Yes.
More than 92%, 92% because the scheme went through.
The scheme went through. It was unprecedented, first one in Australian corporate history where you had that scenario, and we were able to mobilise virtually every shareholder to vote for it. And I think the price signal that was there was actually a very clear signal because the share price went up when we first announced it. The share price went down when TPG said they'd vote against it. So I could actually clearly say your shares will go up if this goes through, as demonstrated by recent history. And we had to delay the scheme meeting a few times on various, because there'd been material changes along the way, which gave you the ability to delay the meeting. And that gave us more time, as it turns out, to mobilise this register and get the vote up.
And then we have this, then we merge it, we change the boards, we all get together, and we have this brief honeymoon period where we have Vocus and Amcom, and everybody gets on really well, and we should have left it, as it so happens. And then James decides that he wants to do a merger with M2, merger of equals. And we decide that we're going to have a composition of boards for all. Me, you, James, and David Spence are going to be the new board, and they're going to elect 4 directors, and we do this deal. And a lot of things went wrong in us doing this deal. James, in the video, in the interview with James, talks about window dressing. I think there's window dressing and then there's window dressing. That's a sort of a euphemism. But when I look back and I sort of know what went wrong with the deal now in hindsight, because hindsight is an exact science. Give us your reflections. Give us your reflections about when we first decided to do the M2 deal, how you felt about that, and why you thought at the time it was a good idea.
Well, I was in two minds because I'd been through a process previously where Amcom considered merging with IINet, and IINet was a single brand, master brand, very successful, pure residential play, and it, whilst it was a good operator, culturally the board and the management of IINet were focused on residential and consumer, and that's what they knew. And Amcom was focused on enterprise, so large government clients, large corporate clients, and infrastructure focused. So we owned our pipes. So if you own the pipe to the customer, you control the quality. And so through a whole, the profiles of both types of businesses are very different. The talks ultimately failed because each side didn't recognise the value of the other side's business. And we had a very large shareholding. So we kept that shareholding and crept over time. And then eventually TPG took over IINet. TPG at that point was substantially a residential and consumer business. So it made sense for those two companies to come together. So the analogy there is that M2 was substantially a reseller with a house of brands and a reseller of substantially Telstra pipes, if we put it that way in non-telco speak. And I did consider that we might have this clash of cultures, but the markets at the time were quite keen for consolidation, and we had a secondary objective in that the business that was very complementary to the Amcom Vocus fibre optic infrastructure enterprise play was NextGen, and NextGen was the 18,000 kilometres of intercapital pipes that connected all the capital cities, and that would join our metropolitan fibre networks. That we had fibre networks in every city. That would join them up like a daisy chain, and we wouldn't have to effectively rent the pipes from Telstra or Optus to provide our national network if we bought NextGen. And so NextGen was a reasonable size business to acquire, and one of the thoughts was that M2 would give us some bulk and allow us to finance the NextGen acquisition.
We all thought M2 was generating quite a lot of cash. I think that was, and we could use the cash to grow our fibre optic business. So
yes,
we do this merger, and we do this merger with them, and then we sort of have our first couple of board meetings. And James's, after we buy NextGen, James's attitude towards the M2 sort of changes quite substantially, in that the information is just not forthcoming. We don't really know what's going on there. Did you sort of have the same issues?
Oh, definitely, yeah. Soon after we settled, trying to forecast the trajectory of the growth in earnings and cash flows through modelling new customer acquisitions, less churn, when you lose customers. And what that looks like in the year ahead was quite opaque, and they weren't really reconciling with the cash flows coming out of it, weren't reconciling with the financial modelling. And so it was very difficult to give guidance. That's what I found difficult. The prevailing and still is the prevailing obligations of boards. If there's a lot of research in the share market and there's an average view of your forward earnings, and if your internal numbers are substantially above or below what the market's published research is forecasting, you've got an obligation to give some guidance to bring it back into sync. That process was very hard after we acquired or merged them too, because it was very opaque in terms of what their earnings trajectory was. I think because they had a lot of systems.
But even what the earnings were opaque. Could you establish what the actual earnings coming from M2 were, and why they weren't being converted into cash? Because I know you were very analytical and spreadsheet driven, and
it was hard to work out what they were capitalising and what was being expensed. So
and where they were putting the expenses. And one of the things that I found is, where were the expenses? What was head office? What was cost of sales done at head office? Because they had all these accounting divisions feeding into the main accounting. Now he couldn't go. The CFO couldn't go do an audit of each division to find out what they were doing with it. So, and suddenly we find that I think you were still there before we put out our first confirmation of earnings. You left. I think you left shortly. You and James left shortly before David put out the confirmation of earnings. But that confirmation of earnings wouldn't have come from David. It would have come from the M2 side of the business. They were running the businesses, and they would have put out the confirmation of earnings.
Yeah, I think we left in October 16 or something like that.
Yeah.
And the issue with their business is that they were comprised of a lot of different businesses that they'd acquired, from iPrimus to Dodo to the ex-Telstra retail voice business that they acquired. It was substantial. And there was a lot of billing systems. And I think they were finding it hard to be able to consolidate all the reported units.
But we were sitting on the board together, and I remember this quite clearly. We sort of trying to get a handle on what the hell's going on here.
Yeah.
And we sort of don't get the answers. And then there becomes this war between Jeff Horth and James. And in my interview with James, he doesn't really know what the issue was at the time. All he says is that he was trying to get information. They weren't giving him the information. But Jeff seemed to be very angry with James at the time.
Yeah, I think there was definitely a clash between James and Jeff, certainly on the provision of information, and certainly in, I guess, personality and styles as well. And Jeff, I think, was having trouble consolidating his numbers and reporting to the board. And he was getting increasingly frustrated. This is Jeff. And so his behaviour was demonstrating that, I think. And I felt less confident over time, as Jeff had been there during the period that they acquired a lot of these businesses and hadn't consolidated them from an operating perspective, because once you acquire a business, you've got to consolidate it and bring it into your core business and try and unify both the billing systems and the reporting systems so that you've got confidence and the businesses are operating synergistically. I don't think they'd actually spent a lot of time consolidating the various disparate businesses they'd acquired, and therefore internal reporting was very reporting in a consolidated sense was very difficult. And so that's when James and I both felt that it may be time to look for a different CEO for the MergeCo. The other issue is that the logic in putting Jeff in as the Vocus M2 MergeCo CEO was that as they were a consumer business, they had a lot more staff, and that both from the contact centres to the administration and sales, and as Vocus side was infrastructure focused and we had less staff, although we had more superior quality of earnings, I felt. Putting Jeff in as CEO was a result of his side brought more staff. And I think in hindsight, we realised that the infrastructure side of the business, the Amcom, Vocus, and ultimately next-gen side of it, was the superior business. And as M2, as a group, they're culturally and their knowledge base was effectively based on consumer brands and consumer offerings that they didn't have a full understanding of our infrastructure business and the quality of our earnings as well. And that was a weakness in the model.
A few things from my point of view is that I think Jeff understood his own numbers. I don't think he wanted us to understand his numbers at all, because what we had bought, they didn't deliver. When I interviewed James, one of the things James said was that M2 board was very close with each other or protected each other. And what I found difficult was how they protected that M2 business by running down the Vocus side of the business continuum, making that they had this wonderful business which was all integrated. And James said, in terms of the integration, said they thought that they integrated their businesses, but the businesses were not integrated, not by any real terms of what integration actually means. I didn't even think that they even thought it was integrated, but Rhoda said that M2 was the only founder-led business that was properly integrated, which I'm sitting there listening to this and I'm thinking, it's not my understanding of what's going on there. Am I missing something about the integration? And clearly they hadn't integrated much. I mean, they had integrated some of it, but when you listen to Chris Deere, he says they still have 10 systems. They hadn't integrated much at all.
Yeah, so there's no operating leverage when you acquire businesses and you don't integrate them.
And you don't
both functionally, people, and systems. These systems roadmaps are really, really important. You've got to consolidate your reporting systems and also your customer-facing systems. And again, being a house of brands, not a branded house, is very difficult because you've got inefficiencies in marketing as well.
So how do you fix that? If you've got a CEO who won't tell the board the problems, and maybe the M2 guys all know what the problems are, but he won't tell the whole board, and he doesn't want to come to the board and say, guys, our business is a big stuff up, let's fix this, because he doesn't want any of us to know. How does one ever fix that? Or does one say the only way of fixing that is that the Vocus guys have to go, or the only way of fixing it is that the CEO has to go? And what we decided was the CEO has to go. And clearly, I mean, the only way you fix something that arrives broken is with new blood.
Yeah. So after we realized that they weren't delivering what we had merged on in terms of the value of their earnings, this is James and I think a lot of the board that came from the Vocus side felt that a change in leadership was probably, in terms of the day-to-day leadership, is what's needed, because you needed someone with fresh eyes that had experience in consumer, I think, and came in with a fresh whiteboard.
A new person coming in will always go to the board and say, these are all the issues we need to fix. The old guard is never going to come to the board and say these are the issues, because a lot of the issues were in their years of running the business created by them, and they're not going to come to the board and now say, listen, I've really not done a great job. So that's why when you get new leadership, first thing they do is come to the board with all the issues that they have found, because then they're not their issues, they are issues that were there and they can actually start to fix them.
Yes. And I think that's the nature of bringing in fresh eyes, though.
That's the nature of bringing in a new person.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, you don't
Correct.
associate it with history.
And when you've got a board, and James made a point in his interview that they were also loyal to each other. So there was this impenetrable sort of group of four who were all sticking up for each other continually, and that doesn't help a business. It doesn't help when you've got a few $1 billion worth of shareholders' money in there. They're not interested in hearing it. They're not interested in you knowing it. And then you just sit there and say, well, I don't know how to fix this, and I really want to be part of fixing this. I mean, the easy thing to do is directors like me to say, well, let's give up, let's just resign. That's the easy part. Then how does anything ever get fixed? If you have good directors, just resign. That institutions can also side with the wrong side, I've found, and that you sit there and wonder why they're doing that when they don't even know what the issues are. They're not prepared to listen to the issues, and if they side, you're never going to get it fixed if they're siding with one side. It's just impossible to get this fixed. And you need fresh people to come and fix it. You need it desperately to come and sort out the issues. Otherwise, the share price is just going to go as it was, going down to oblivion almost.
Well, the market doesn't trust the company. It's as they say, up by the stairs and down by the lift well. Fear is a bigger driver than greed, and institutions will sell if they don't trust.
And in my previous life, a chairman came to me and said to me, I have to fire the CEO of one of the companies I was responsible for. And I said to the guy, how can I fire the CEO who's been there for 20 years? And he said to me, you've got two choices. You can go and fire the guy, or you can go fire the 500 and something people that work for him. What would you rather do? And I said, when you put it in those terms, we've got to get a new CEO. And it's a lesson I've learned. What about the rest of the staff that work for him? What about the institutions? What about all the investors? What about them?
Yeah, it's actually a bit selfish when you're protecting your own small team through loyalties or whatever it is, when there's so many other stakeholders, thousands of shareholders, mums and dads shareholders, hundreds and thousands of staff, hundreds of staff, and thousands if you talk about the contact centres. And it's very clear from an outsider's point of view, you need to have change, fresh eyes. Craig and David Spence, the deputy chairman and the chairman, came to see me in Perth. They came to see me after I signalled that I was ready to retire, because I'd been there for 15 years since Amcom was a startup as a co-founder to the penultimate event for me. It was when post M2 we couldn't get the forecasting right because we couldn't get the information out of the M2 systems. So I was ready to leave and retire. And Craig and David came over and said, oh, can you stay? Because there's a substantial staff group and a lot of the earnings and assets are in the Amcom side of the business as part of the Vocus side of the business. And I said, I'll consider that, but I've got some ideas, I've got some conditions. And so that was leading up to the meeting where James and I left. But the proposal was quite simple, that we need to have an evolution of, not a revolution. I was happy to get Jeff to retire gracefully, make it his decision, and bring in internal succession, which I prefer, maybe some outside advice if we needed some of the systems to be changed. And that was quite a reasonable ask, I think, and it was only in response to them asking me to stay. And the result was a very hostile meeting. I was very surprised. So when we actually came to meet again to put this on the table, the board had a series of resignations put in front of us for James and I to go. And I don't know what changed in between when they asked me to stay, and I'd proposed to have an internal search or a succession strategy to bring in a new CEO with some outside help. And that was a very reasonable request.
I don't know either. I've got to say, they kept me, because I was quite close to James, they kept me entirely out of that loop. So the shock to me was as big as the shock to you guys. And in fact, I kept quite a lot of time saying, if you allow this to happen, the share price is going to go downwards big time. And of course, I was right.
You stayed for quite some time, so that was I admire that you stuck in there and tried to make some changes.
I tried very hard to make changes, and David and I tried enormously. When David sort of realized that changes need to get made, we tried very hard. Bear in mind, at that stage, we were 4-2. There were 4 of them, 2 of us. And then Bob came along. So we thought there were 3 of us and 4 of them. And maybe we could use Bob to help persuade them of the right thing to do. But somehow Bob changed his mind. 10 minutes after agreeing not to. 10 minutes after agreeing to try and make some changes, he changed his mind at the actual board meeting.
I was a bit disappointed in that meeting when David sided with the M2 directors. In my experience at Amcom, we only ever had 3 CEOs, and they were all they all retired when they realised they'd been there too long, or I realised and suggested they go. And then we brought in a new CEO who had fresh eyes. And the same experience at INET when we were there. The founder, Mike Malone, decided to retire when he wasn't feeling it anymore. And we brought in David Buckingham, who was the CFO. So I find internal succession with the next generation who know the business, but who've got a lot of ideas that they want to see change, but haven't been able to under a previous CEO, is the most successful and less disruptive. And this was the first time I'd seen such board turmoil and such culture clash and such resistance to suggesting that a CEO who'd been there for a long time and had overseen a lot of their acquisitions but hadn't done the consolidation of their businesses in an operating sense and the integration. This is the first time I'd seen such resistance to a CEO change, which was as obvious to everyone except for the M2 guys.
And one of the things I found when we were at Vocus, there was very little politics. In the whole of my Vocus time, the board generally got on. We all made decisions what we believed were right interest of the business. We considered sort of everybody. And we never made decisions that were that selfish. Cultures were so dramatically different. James had a culture of inclusiveness. Of, he had his big expressions of culture up on the wall. Don't screw the customers, don't be a muppet, don't be a dickhead, all of those. He allowed people to make decisions, empowered his staff, had some fantastic, wonderful, loyal staff. And everyone I've interviewed who worked at Vocus loved working at Vocus. Interesting, in my podcast, despite the fact that I think a lot of people, including a lot of the M2 guys, probably have listened to it, no one has come forward from M2 at all, and I have asked to come forward and say, do you want to be interviewed? Open interview, say what you want, say I'm wrong. And nobody's come forward. But all the Vocus people are coming forward and saying they want to be interviewed. And they're all saying what a different culture it was and how it changed dramatically, and how from a place that became fun to work with was no longer fun to work at.
Yeah, you can only you've got to have a values-based business, don't you? You can't command and control. You've got to have a values-based business so that and then devolve responsibility to people to act through the values. If you're an old-fashioned command and control business that doesn't live the values and doesn't have values, then you're going to have very sad staff who feel unempowered. And that's the two observations. James he devolved responsibility to people, let them, gave them some rope, and through the values, no muppets, etc. Customer first. As long as those values are kept up, then they'll make the right decisions through their own decision trees, and that was a big difference between those businesses.
Okay. Are there any other insights you'd like to share?
I feel so that on the M2 side of the board, you also had obviously had Vaughan Bowen and Mick Simmons, and I feel that when they were in control of the business after we retired, they realised the value of infrastructure, and they went on, and I was happy to work with them again at Unity, which we cornerstoned and financed and ultimately floated, and that was a very successful business. And Mick did a very good job as the CEO of that business. So I don't harbour any ill will. I guess I think it was just an interesting experience observing people, and I've kept a relationship with those people because I think they evolved too. They learned the power of infrastructure, and maybe they took something away from that whole debacle.
I was also an investor in Unity Wireless, I do have to say. Did a right out of that. So thank you. One of the ones before they floated, one of the private investors, then they floated up, did sell down a lot during my time, but then I held on to quite a bit and floated at the end. Yeah, look, everybody learned what upset me the most, the way they were so vociferous about the Vocus business versus the M2 business, and some of the comments which came through about what a basket case Vocus was versus what a fantastic business M2 was, and you're sitting there listening and thinking, is this rehearsed for me, or do you really believe that? And nobody says a word. Nobody comes and corrects them. Nobody. Everyone, the board are like stunned mullets, except for me saying, "This, what is going on here?"
Yeah.
Even doing that.
When I was at IONET, it was parallel to Amcom, we acquired the AAPT consumer business, which was a reasonably substantial but old business at the time. And Rhoda had been a senior executive at AAPT. When we acquired it, we had to make all these changes. Her experience as an exec at AAPT, which she brought into the M2 board, was quite similar in my experience. At the time was a Telecom New Zealand subsidiary, and it had a corporate side, fibre, which was the old PowerTel, and it had a consumer business. Consumer business was Philippine call centres, and so the IONET team over time cleaned it up, and it became they turned it from a loss-making business into adding quite a lot of earnings value to IONET. But we merged the AAPT brand over to IONET eventually as well. The register, is a cruel beast. So John Ho took 18% from it. Yeah. So John, and then soon after that, you had Jeff Horth left in February 18. The larger shareholders who came in, I'm guessing, saw that there needed to be some changes. And of course, in June 17, KKR and Affinity had a look at the business at $3.50. And they did some DD, and then the risk on the consumer business turnaround was too high, and so that they didn't want to make the bid formal at that price. They valued the infrastructure side of the business though, which ended up doing about 2/3 of the earnings, maybe higher, in reality. And so I think the proof's in the pudding. You've got KKR and Affinity coming in, doing their diligence, being uncomfortable with the consumer business as a risk, and walking away. And then Mirror, Macquarie Asset Management, which is an infrastructure asset manager, really buying the business, for $5.50 in June 21, because they wanted the infrastructure, not because they wanted the consumer business, which is the old M2 stuff. So I think that was a telling bit of chronology.
The M2 business cost us $1.5 billion straight.
Is it a cautionary tale on due diligence, though, as well?
The point about due diligence, because I actually thought about the due diligence.
Yeah.
Quite a lot. The reality is that we can't be expected to go and audit transactions that are happening at the time. And there is a very interesting internal audit report. Shows some of the steps that M2 took between when we started talking to them to the time we did the deal. Now, how you pick that up without going to do a total re-audit of the whole place, I have I have absolutely no idea.
They were their annual. They were doing about 400,000 new customers a year, but their churn was about 400,000 customers. That's a stat that stuck in my head. And so if you're turning over your whole customer base in a year, think of what that does to the economics of it, especially when you've got to pay to get them connected, and there's a bit of CapEx, which may or may not be expensed or capitalized or whatever it is. Yeah, that was a pretty bad business, actually. About 3,000 call center staff went on my ratio of how many customers they had to call center staff that you usually use as a rule of thumb we used at INET. They'd need about 1,500. So they were throwing bodies at it because the network was bad. They didn't have enough bandwidth from Telstra when the Netflix effect occurred and everybody went into streaming. They couldn't negotiate that bandwidth because it would take them about 3 months to lift the bandwidth. And by that time, you've churned a bunch of customers because they've got the spinning wheel of death on their screen. And then when you've got a network issue, people call into your customer service. So if the network works, you don't have to worry about customer service as much because it's working. You don't get as many calls. If it's a bit of a mess, then they're all calling in. So you're throwing bodies at it, and at 40, 50 grand a year per FTE. And
we just thought that the numbers were real, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And if the numbers were real, this would have worked out pretty well anyway. It doesn't matter, every business has got its own issues.
When they asked me to stay, and I said we'd have to move Jeff, get him to retire. Part of that was to get James. Part of the plan was to have James come into the ascendancy into like a deputy chair role or a director of infrastructure, basically running the infrastructure, recognising that was a really important part of the business, and then bringing someone else to sort out the consumer business. And that would have, and I had someone in mind too.
Did you know the new guy who took over?
Kevin,
yeah.
No, I didn't know him. How did he go? Did a pretty good job.
I wasn't there for that long in Kevin's time, and hindsight in the exact science, we got $5.50 a share for the business.
Yeah.
So he must have done a few things right.
Yeah.
Also, he brought in a lot of Telstra people, so we Telstrafied a lot of the people. And look, we recognized, I think he recognized the problems in the M2 business. Of course, the biggest catalyst that came in, the best thing was John Ho, of course, because he put up with none of this.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's what I was sort of referring to.
Exactly what you said. It's exactly what you said.
Big shareholders. They see what's happening and they move people on. Yeah. I did speak to him at one point too. He was just getting a bit of background on the infrastructure side of the business.
I'll tell you this, Tony, it's been an absolutely wonderful interview, and really thank you for your time. And I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, John. It's great to speak to you again.